We've got Pat Mervine here, who has written a wonderful book on Boone Farm, which is the new home for the African American Museum of Bucks County. I know a little bit about Pat. She is a member of Middletown Meeting. She is a retired speech pathologist and an avid quilter. Pat is here to talk about her book and the history of Boone Farm. And so I'm just going to turn it right over to you. Take it away, Pat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your interest in this topic, and it's exciting to be able to share the history of the Boone Farm and also talk about its future, because that's just as important. All right, this is a picture of the Boone Farm, and I will orient you as to where it is as we go along. First thing we do when we talk about any property in Pennsylvania is we really need to acknowledge the people who were here first. And in our case, of course, that's the Lenni Lenape. So I would just like to read this to you so that we can just pause for a minute and honor those folks. This land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, called the Lenape home. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and the early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remained among the continuing historical tribal communities in the region. And they're listed there: the Nanacoke Lenape tribe, tribal nation, the Ramapo Lenape nation, and the Powhatan Lenape nation, the Nanacoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamadin that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. And I would like to say that the people from the African American Museum, which will be taking over that property, share this feeling and will be honoring the Lenni Lenape when the museum opens. It's important that we know about the Lenni Lenape because they lived right here on this property, hunted and fished. When you think about the property and its location on 413, you'll notice that it's very close, and we'll look at a map. It's very close to the Neshaminy Creek, where the Core Creek comes in. And it's only a couple of miles from Playwicky, which is where 3 different excavations were done and found evidence of tribal lands there, including Henry Mercer, who was in this picture and put up a monument to that. And here's a map that shows you basically where it is. Right here is where the farm is. If you're not familiar with the area, I just want to orient you. This is the Neshaminy Creek. Right here is where Core Creek comes in. You see a lake there now, but there was not a lake at the time. And it's over here where you see Playwicky Farm. So this would have been prime hunting and fishing ground at that time. This is a painting by our own Edward Hicks, who was born in Langhorne, in the Langhorne Coffee House. And this was his impression of Penn with the Native Americans signing the treaties and maintaining a peaceful model for the future. Of course, we know that did not continue with his children, but that's for another time. Here's just a map to orient you again. This is a map of Bucks County. And you'll notice that, well, William Penn first came here. He laid out 5 different areas. It was Makefield, which is Upper and Lower Makefield, Buckingham, which is now Bristol and Bristol Township, Falls, Salem, which we now know is Bensalem. And then there was this area in the middle that they couldn't come up with a clever name for, so they simply called it Middle Lots or Middletown. That's where we are right now. And Middletown Township once included Langhorne Borough, Langhorne Manor, Pendle, and Uneville. Okay, Middletown Township today is really a sprawling, shapeless thing, and it doesn't really have much of an identity. And it is bisected, as I said, by these little towns. It has a population of 46,000. But Middletown Township has a very interesting history. The Swedish and Dutch were the first to come here. They settled around the 1600s. The English, Welsh, Scottish, the Quakers, and the Irish followed. And according to the Middletown Township website, they say that the Dutch settlers copied the Native American practice of planting sycamore trees along waterways. Sycamores have an affinity for water, so that's a natural place for them to be. But they found that they could use basically every part of the tree for medicinal purposes, for building, for canoes, and that distinctive white bark really marked the water sources. I only bring this up because when you walk around the property at the Boone Farm, you will still see sycamores. Some of them are very, very old, and some of them are, I'm sure, are the progeny of those original trees. And there's a shot of the house looking from the creek, and you can see just how dominant those trees are. The beginning of Middletown, the land was apportioned to 30 landowners. Some of the people never lived here, but if anybody lives in this area and you've driven around any of our housing developments, those last names will be familiar because they're the names of a lot of the roads. We know that Nicholas Waln arrived on the Welcome with William Penn, and he established Middletown Friends Meeting, then called a Neshamina. And that was actually on the banks of the Neshaminy Creek. There's no evidence that we can find of that particular meeting house, but it was replaced later on with 2 meeting houses on the property where we are today. And that goes back to 1682. So just to give us a time frame, there was a small cabin, as I said, and now the present meeting house that we use was built in 1793. Whoops. Okay. Why is this important to our story? Well, it's important to all of you because you're Quaker, and so you would want to know that. But it's important because most of the owners of the property, in fact, were Quakers. And I don't really need to read all of this to you. You know how important Quaker life is, the Quaker religion, to all aspects of our life. There was certainly a strong emphasis on education. The Quakers first hired a teacher to teach in their homes, then they built the school. And actually, until about 8 years ago, there was always a school right in Langhorne, which was very important because it became a very literate community. And that's important to know. And of course, we all know that Newtown Friends and George School are within Middletown Township as well. Okay. So now we get to our timeline, and I did build a timeline for this because there are, in the span of 300 years, there are 21 owners, and I'm going to get through them pretty quick. I'd be happy to take any questions at the end. But just so you know, back in 1704, 818 acres were deeded from William Penn to Robert Heaton. And that included all of the area that is all around the Bridgetown area that we just described, extends all through Core Creek Park, that entire region. Okay, and here's a map to show you exactly what we're talking about. Back in 1704, when that happened, there were 3 buildings that still remain today or close to it. As I said, our meeting house was replaced, but you know that there was a meeting house in Langhorne. You'll see up in the upper corner, there is the remnants of a mill that was known as the Preston Mill. Now we call it the Bridgetown Mill, but that was built in 1704. And there was also what we now call the Langhorne Hotel, which was the 4 Lanes End Tavern. And it's important to think about Langhorne and its first name, which was 4 Lanes End. It was called that. It was an organically grown town because it happened to be where 2 major roads crossed. You have your east-west road, you have your north-south. If anyone is traveling at all through this region and they wanted to change direction, that's where they would change. If they needed to stop and water their horse, get refreshments, spend the night, that's where they would stay. So this was a very important area in this region. And as I said, it was called 4 Lanes End. This is my first delve into historic research, and I just want to point out a few of the funny things I found along the way. Some of the challenges. One of them is the fact that Langhorne had 3 different names. That was very difficult sometimes to track. Roads didn't all have names. People didn't have addresses. It's quite a fun challenge. It's also a challenge that the fact that family members are all named the same thing. And boy, does that make it difficult to figure out, which John are you talking about? But it's an interesting delve. So this is where we are. And I point out these buildings because they really represent all aspects of life. You have the rural industrial region, which was the mill. You have the tavern, which is like the town center and entertainment and refreshment. And of course, you have the meeting house, which was the religious base. This is a more compressed map, just showing you exactly where we're talking about. This is the Neshaminy Creek. Here is Core Creek, and the home would be right around here that we're discussing. You'll notice that it says Bridgetown, and we do call it Bridgetown today, but it was only called Bridgetown after the bridge was built. For a long time, there was no bridge there, and even up through the Revolutionary War period, on the maps, it is called Cuckoldstown. We don't know why it's called Cuckoldstown, but that's the name that it had. Some speculation is that there was a house of ill repute on the corner, and maybe that had something to do with the name, but I can't vouch for that. Okay, it's very important to know that this region that we pass through right now and really only notice if we're stopped at the light or if the creek is flooded, this was a very important region because this was the rural industrial center of Middletown Township. On the Neshaminy Creek, there were many mills. There's still one you can see in Unionville. The Bridgetown Mill is still there. On Core Creek, there was the fulling mill right behind the farm. And also, it's reported that there were 6 mills on Core Creek, 3 in Middletown and 3 going into Newtown Township. So even though this was farmland, this was really a hub of activity, and situated as it was between Langhorne and Newtown, which became the county seat. It was a major road there. It still is a major road, but it was at the time. Just to point out how important mills were to the area, you see how many there were in the 1700s. 4 fulling mills, 23 sawmills, 52 corn mills, 1 oil mill, and 1 paper mill. Today, there are only 2 working mills in town, in the county. One is more for demonstration, and one is actually a working mill. If you're wondering what is a fulling mill, that is a mill that prepared cloth to be softened and then to be sewn. And the fulling mill was located. Actually, it's right now inside the or underneath the lake that was created, Lake Luxembourg in Core Creek Park. There is a fulling mill road, and if you follow that fulling mill road to the edge of the creek and just look out to the center, that's where that would have been. Okay, so you can just imagine that anybody who had anything to do with a mill would be crossing back and forth in this area. All right, in 1706, Robert Heaton sold off 4 acres of land to his son and a friend, Thomas Stackhouse, to build the first mill out in Core Creek, and that is one that is behind the house. And you'll see that those 4 acres plus the extra acre and 67 perches, that property stays outside of the Boone Farm property for quite some time. It remains separate by itself, and the Boone Farm property would wrap around it, which is very interesting. As I was reading all of these documents, I went up to the recorder of deeds, and I have the deeds for all of the owners, and reading through them is quite a challenge, especially when they're all handwritten. But you'll see that it mentions perches and it goes on. There's so much language in there that we really don't use anymore, that in the book I explain that I round things off, but a perch is a portion of an acre. Okay. It's interesting because my husband and I, during the pandemic, we live right near Core Creek. We decided to go off the main path and into the woods and hike just for something to do. And lo and behold, we came across what looked like the remnants of a mill. But we thought this can't possibly be because we know Fulling Mill was out in the middle of the lake. But sure enough, that's when we discovered that there were actually 6 mills here, and there are still remnants that you can find as you're hiking through. Okay, and there they are. So that was kind of a neat find for us. All right, in 1716, Robert Heaton deeded land to Godfrey Kirk. And you'll often hear the house referred to as the Godfrey Kirk House. That's because he was the builder of this first property. The deed reads that he had been on the property for some time, and there is speculation that there was a cabin and the beginnings of a farm had already been started before Godfrey Kirk bought this. But there's no evidence that we can find architecturally. What we can find, of course, is the house. And Godfrey Kirk, there it is, right there. That's where he built it. Okay, Godfrey Kirk was a stonemason. He was a son of a mason who came from England. They settled in the Wrightstown area. When his father died, he received some money and he used some of that to purchase this land and to start building this house. Godfrey Kirk became a member of Wrightstown Meeting. He married, he's buried in Wrightstown Meeting along with his wife. And just one of the weird little things I found in doing the research, not only is Godfrey and Rachel's grave there, but the very last owners of the farm, Cheshire and Grace Boone, are also buried at Wrightstown Meeting. So I just thought that was kind of a neat little circle to be closed. Godfrey's brother was a stonemason, and he was the contractor for Graham Park, which was the provincial governor's palace out in Horsham. So if you've ever been there, there is a relationship there. And I wonder if he perhaps didn't build that as well.
Huh.
You know, as I was reading through all of these records, and I knew that this building was going to be the African American Museum, I was really interested to find, were there any ties to any African Americans on this property? And in fact, I discovered this. Samuel Kirk, this is Godfrey's son, had been a member of Wrightstown Meeting, and he was actually written out of Meeting because at the time when the Quakers were expected to free their slaves through manumission, he sold his slave. And there is a minute here that I was able to find that said he deviated from the Christian testimony held by friends against keeping our fellow creatures slaves for life, as to buy a Negro, and after kindly being treated with an order to procure the Negro's freedom, he hath sold him to be continued into slavery during life. We hereby give forth this testimony against such said unchristian practice of buying and selling mankind for the term of life, and we can have no further unity with him. And it goes on to say that he is just not welcome anymore in the meeting. Wow. So I thought that was interesting. There is no proof that that Godfrey had any slaves on the property, but we will find some later. Okay, this is what the cabin looked like at the time. And I bordered in red the only part of it that did exist. It was a one-room cabin, one room downstairs, and it was only like a 3/4 room upstairs, low ceiling. So it was not as high as what you're seeing. So just think about that piece bordered in red. That was it. Okay, this is a picture inside. This was taken in 1980 in that era. It shows you the fireplace. It's 7 feet wide. It's very impressive, 4'10" high. The stone benches that you see there were not original, but there is a beehive oven on the right-hand side that does not show in this picture. The area that's bordered in blue would not have been there. That was added by the Boones when they bought the farm They probably did this in about 1920, but at that time that Godfrey Kirk lived there, it would have been a solid wall and then a stairway going up to the loft bedroom. Okay, there is a diagram of it. There was paperwork prepared by Catherine Auerbach, who is an architectural historian. She prepared this for the National Register, and it shows you in the green section is what I'm talking about. This is the downstairs, the single room. Okay, 3 years later, he added the section 2 that you see there on the left. And what's very interesting is when this was built, section 2, it's a completely separate house, although it is attached. And what makes it very unusual is it would not be odd to see row homes, twin homes in a town, but you don't see that out on a farm, on farmland somewhere. It was very strange, but it really indicates that Godfrey knew this was a burgeoning area, that housing would be needed. And so he was a very industrious young man, and he built a house smack up against his own. They share the chimney stack. So 3 years later, this part was added to it. Okay, and that's the section that he added. In this case, it is down at the bottom, one room again, and then up at the top, it is a full, all the way up to the rooftop, a bedroom up there. Okay, for a long time, and I don't know when it happened, but for many, many years, this building was stuccoed over. So even as a child, I remember seeing it, it was all white. However, when the county took possession of it, they started doing some renovation. And one of the first things they did was to remove the stucco. That actually is a really good thing, because now we can see exactly where the two halves of this building were joined together. Okay, you see the difference in the stone? And there again. Okay, and there you can see the two halves. So they're cockeyed. There's nothing symmetrical about it. They're not even as far as the plane that they're on. One is a step down from the other. And as I said, they were never joined for many, many years inside. They were two separate dwellings. Okay, Godfrey Kirk, he sold the west half of the building. That would be the part going toward 413. He sold that and 34 acres in 1719 to Jeremiah Dungan. And I won't read this to you, but let me tell you, it's very weird, convoluted language. And it explains that he was selling the house from the chimney to the west. From the center of the chimney to the west is what he was selling to Jeremiah Dungan. And he maintained the right. What's very strange about it is that he has to put in a right of way because of the position of the house. The house is not parallel to the road and to the creek, but it's on an odd angle, kind of sort of perpendicular, not quite. And what he had to do when he wrote the deeds is he had to allow permission, a right of way, for the person who owned the left half or the west half of the house to be able to get to the water. And the person who owned the right half or the east side of the house had to be able to get to the road. So this weird right of way is written into every deed that you see. And it just puzzled me no end. And I kept thinking, my gosh, if you just turn the house around so that it's parallel, you both go out the front door to the road, you both go out the back door to the creek. Like, wouldn't that have made sense? And I ran that by Jeff Marshall from the Heritage Conservancy, who knows everything about everything for historic architecture. And he explained to me that the house was not positioned for convenience and access, but it was really positioned to take advantage of southern exposure. The sun was very important, and that's why it was positioned the way it was. So that made sense, but the deeds have this crazy little right-of-way thing in there, guaranteeing that their heirs and assigns will always be able to get to the water or to the road. All right, Jeremiah Dungan. was there. He was a tailor. He was from England. His family ended up moving to Northampton, so you may read about people with that name more in the Northampton region than in Middletown. And even though he was came from a family of Baptists, he was a member of Middletown Friends Meeting. Okay, 3 years after he built that, he sold the other half to Edward Glover. And at this point, this is when Godfrey moved to Wrightstown, became a member of Wrightstown Meeting. He married and had a family. Okay, Edward Glover, again, it's the same kind of crazy language, you know, the east side and the west side, and allowing for that right of way. When we think about the house, we need to realize just how unique it is. This was from William W.H. Davis, who wrote so many books about local history. And he describes the typical house, which would have been made of wood and would have had certain number of rooms and been positioned in certain ways, but looking like a cabin as we would expect. This house does not, you know, fill that description at all. And what makes it so unique is, for one thing, it is one of the oldest existing houses in Middletown. I think it's the second oldest. The first half built prior to 1716, and then the second half in 1719. Most cabins were made of wood. This was not. And as I said, it was an unusual thing to have a duplex in that area. What's really unique about it is, while some changes were made over time, the majority of the materials and the features of the original building are still very much visible. They really haven't been disguised at all. So it's pretty neat. And I'll show you pictures toward the end when I actually got to go into the house in October and take photographs. It looks like Godfrey Kirk just walked out the door. I can tell you, it's very, very primitive. These pictures were taken in 1988 for that application to the National Register. And you can see the walls were plastered. Some of the woodwork trims and doors were considered to be original. This is that downstairs room of the original part number 1, section 1. And this would be the kitchen. You see that a radiator was added. You see up at the top here, there is an electrical line. All of that's gone now. All of this plaster is gone now. All of the woodwork is gone. That had all been taken out. Okay, there's the, okay. And Edward Glover then bought the house. All right, Edward Glover was a saddler. And that meant that he was very well-to-do, because horses were so important to the economy. They had to have horses for transportation. Horses were used for work. And so saddlers were very valued members of the community, because they needed all of the leather goods that went along with the horses. Also in this area, you'll notice, you may often hear that this area was for artisans. These are the artisans they were talking about. In this particular area in Bridgetown and Four Lanes End, there was a tannery, there was a blacksmith, a wheelwright, there was a wagon and coach maker. So all of these people were very involved in this community. Edward Glover, he did very well. He lived on that property for 21 years. He was obviously a person of means, although it does appear that he ran into some financial difficulties. He had purchased 232 acres above the Kirk parcel, and he held that land for 15 years. At one point in 1740, he sold that to Joseph Richardson, and then he had to sell the whole 60 acres and the house to William Carter to settle a debt. So from what I was reading, it seems like he did really well. He overextended himself, and then he got into trouble. So the land was then sold to William Carter. Oddly enough, William Carter only kept it for a day, and he sold it then to William Glover. You have to remember that there weren't banks at this time. So it was not unusual for people to lend money and be mortgage holders. And in this case, he sold it after a day. And even though the names are Glover, Edward Glover, William Glover, I looked in the genealogy and I couldn't find any relationship. So I just don't know. All I do know is that by William Carter helping out and selling that land, he made $2,100 in that one day, and which is not a bad return. Okay, at this point, after a couple of years, William Glover sold to Jonas Preston. The picture of the mill that I showed you in 1704, that's still there, you can still see it at the Bridgetown Mill House, that was owned by the Prestons, and they were millers. Joseph Preston took over the grist mill, and he took over that 5 acres of land, that mill I described to you that was back behind the farm. And in this particular deed, when they were selling it, it still talks about selling 2 dwellings. So my suspicion is that the house still hadn't been broken through, even though the prior owner owned both halves. You know, Edward Glover owned both halves of the house. It doesn't seem that he ever broke through, that they still remain 2 separate homes. So I wonder if he either rented half of it or used half of it as a shop, perhaps, for his saddle making. I do not know. I have no evidence of that, but just from reading the deed, it does appear that that it stayed 2 separate homes at that point. Okay. All right. So Jonas Preston is an interesting guy. He was a descendant of English settlers, and he was the stepson of Joseph Canby. If you're from this area, you know Canby was a big name at the time. He was a landowner, a politician. He was a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And through that association, by living with him, Jonas Preston really developed a high degree of sophistication, and he was exposed to people of influence. He was able to use his influence as an adult to get roads improved, and he was the one who had the bridge built that went to his mill. So we can thank him for that. He and his wife Jane were active members of Middletown Friends Meeting, and then later they moved to Buckingham Meeting. He served on 3 grand juries, and he was a partner in an importing business. So he was a very interesting guy. But he also tells us another story, and that is the story of just how hard life was for people at this time. He was married and widowed 4 times, and that's really an indication of how short-lived the lives were of the women of childbearing years. 7 years after he moved to the farm, his first wife, Jane, died in 1749 after bearing him 9 children. At the time of her death, the oldest was 16, the youngest was 2. At one point, they had lost a 3-year-old son and a 1-year-old daughter within 4 days of each other. And that happened while Jane was pregnant with yet another child. Although Jonas Preston had 3 sons altogether, he had 3 sons named Jonas Preston with 3 different wives, but only the last one survived to adulthood. So he went on to become a doctor in Chester County. But when I was reading their story, and I was interested in, my whole focus really is the people. Who are these people? How did they fit into the community? What were their lives like? His life really gave me pause, because I realized just how difficult life would have been for women at this time. That was just a sad story. Anyway, this is when they were joining Middletown Meeting. I put this in here just to show you the kind of documents that I had to read. They're really, really hard to read sometimes. It was very difficult to get through some of the handwriting, some of the condition of the materials, but it is just amazing what you can find online. These are all available on Ancestry when you go into the Quaker Minutes portal, which was great. Okay, he lived there for 22 years with those various wives and all of those kids. And remember now how small that house was. So I'm going to guess that he broke through at the time. I would think he would have to have that extra space. But then he sold the property to Thomas Martin. So now, so far, all of the owners have been Quaker. Thomas Martin is not, okay, and that is important. But he sold that 60 acres plus some other tracts there, including the mill, to Thomas Martin. Now, this is an interesting story. Thomas Martin was married to a woman named Mary of Four Lanes End. There were a number of Marys at the time. We don't know which one it was. But his time on the property was short-lived. He bought the property in 1760. He wrote a will in 1760, and he died in 1760. When he prepared his will, it included an inventory, as most wills did at the time. And it reflected a really comfortable lifestyle. He had numerous cows, pigs, sheep, horses. He had beehives, carpentry tools, a clock in a case, a feather bed, and it went on and on and on to describe this really nice home that would have been very comfortable for his life. However, you'll see on these three columns, all of these are assessed as far as being in pounds, shillings, and pence. And you'll notice I have highlighted that he did have in his possession a Negro fellow, okay? And you'll also notice that it is by far the most valuable possession that he owned. This list goes on for pages, and that is the most valuable thing that he owned was this Negro fellow. He was Presbyterian, and he was buried in Newtown Presbyterian Church. Now, the saga continues. This family was very interesting. The next year, 1761, Thomas's widow remarried. She married David Marple, and a petition was made to the court to remove her son Daniel, who was 7 years old at the time, from her care. It reads in part, "The widow hath behaved herself in a manner unsuitable to the trust of this court by marrying to a person of low character and leading a disorderly life with her neighbors." I have no idea what she would have done to require that, but that's how she was described to the court, and the court agreed. They actually removed Daniel from her care and gave her to the care of the Wynkoop family in Northampton. Mary advertised the property for sale a couple years later. This particular advertisement is not her home, but it certainly could have been. Everything that's mentioned in this ad describes the farm exactly. Unfortunately, it didn't sell. And so she deeded the house and the 60 acres to her son, Daniel, who was then a 10-year-old minor. And it appears from the Martin family history that I read that the property was rented until he came of age. The remaining tracts that he had was sold to William Thompson. And I believe that might have been the same Thompson as Thompson Mill. Okay, and then we get to Daniel. Daniel grows up. Daniel goes to Princeton University, becomes a lawyer, and he was also the Bucks County tax collector. When he lived on the farm, he lived there during the 1790 census. And I found this very interesting because it indicates his household as having one free white male over 16, that would have been him, 3 free white males under 16, which would have been his sons. And then it just says 5 free white females. No, doesn't matter how old they are. That apparently wasn't important. Just 5 free white females, 1 other free person, and 1 slave named John, who was 5 years old. So this is the first time that we have documented on this property, other than the will from his father, that there was, in fact, another enslaved person on the property. I was so intrigued when I read this, because each time I read the census from all these different eras, they ask for things in a different way. This is the first time I saw that, as I said, it didn't matter the age of white females. And what is this other free person? I don't know. We don't know the sex. We don't know the race. We really don't know. I would like to think that it was his mother, John's mother, but I have no idea. So it's just interesting to see how these things are presented and how sensibilities change over time. There it is again. This is from the Office of the Prothonotary. They have a register of slaves, and it's quite lengthy how many slaves there actually were in Bucks County. And that does bring us to this topic. Okay, this is a picture of the house that is now the Daniel Martin House. It's in Langhorne Borough, in the part of the area called Washington Village, and that does still stand. Okay, slavery in Pennsylvania. They were first brought here by the Dutch. It was protected by the British government, and there was such a need for labor that it outweighed the moral concerns. We know the slaves were, William Penn and others, had them. And here are some of the records. By 1790, when that census was taken, in Bucks County, there were at this point 261 people still enslaved. 581 were free. But of course, there were many more prior to that. You see, this date is well over 100 years after, well, a long time after the Quakers started to have manumission. By 1800, all of the Quakers had freed their slaves. By 1820, there were still 11 African Americans enslaved in Bucks County. And as I said, a lot of these topics, this needs to be gone into, investigated a lot more than I could ever cover in this presentation. But I hope that it just increases your awareness of what's going on. There were so many slave owners in this area. I only pulled out the names of the ones that related to the house: the Thomas and Daniel Martin, the Wincoops, Jeremiah Dungan, Joseph Richardson for Lane's End, and Samuel Kirk, as we discussed earlier, from Ricetown. Jeremiah Langhorne himself had many slaves working on his estate in Langhorne, and also up at the Durham Iron Works, where he had an interest. In his will in 1742, he manumitted any enslaved person over the age of 24, and he stipulated freedom for slaves under the age of 24 to be freed at that age. And that really became the genesis of some of the historically Black communities that we have in our small towns like Bristol, Langhorne, Yardley, that they were freed and then settled in those areas. Also the areas in Middletown known as Little Guinea and Timbuktu. I happen to live in Langhorne near Bridgetown Pike, and this area is called Bucktoe, which they believe is a corruption of Timbuktu. And I don't know if you're aware, but Cujo and Joe were two slaves owned by Jeremiah Langhorne. They were freed and given life rights to land, which is now Doylestown Borough. The Quakers moved to abolition, and I know with all you Quakers, I don't have to go into this too much. But here are the dates. And shortly after, Bucks Quakers agreed to denounce, but not outright ban slaveholding. So there was a time when they said, okay, we won't buy more slaves, but we will keep the ones we have, at least for a time. And in Middletown Friends, I have to say they were slow in releasing them, so that in 1763, there were so many Friends continuing to purchase Negroes in Middletown that a committee was sent out to endeavor to convince them that this was inconsistent with the principles. And as I said, by 1800, they were all freed. We get up to the Declaration of Independence. And that brings us, of course, to the war. The war did touch Middletown, so this area where that farm was would have been affected. We do have in Langhorne the Revolutionary War Cemetery had been discovered, and there are monuments and interpretive signs there for you to see. We also know that there were buildings in Langhorne Borough that were used as hospitals and resting places for soldiers who were wounded or sickened through the Battle of Trenton. And that would have been the Richardson House, Middletown Friends Meeting House, and the schoolhouse, the tannery, and the Hicks House, where Edward Hicks was born, which we now know as the Langhorne Coffee House. So all of those areas were involved. And then there was also the Fulling Mill raid, and this would have affected the neighbors who owned the house at the Boone Farm. As I said, the Fulling Mill was right behind the house, little further down Core Creek, which is now, as I said, in the middle of the lake. And at that point, they were preparing fabric to be taken to Newtown, to the Bird in Hand area, the tavern, where tailors were sewing the fabric into uniforms that were desperately needed by Washington's troops during those bitter cold winters at Valley Forge. General Howe knew about this. He wanted to stop it. And so he found two loyalist captains from Bucks County, one from Newtown, one from Hilltown, to arrange for a raid. 70 soldiers dressed in green uniforms. They traveled 28 miles from Tarsdale, and they traveled all the way over to the Fulling Mill. The Fulling Mill was taken by surprise, and the Continental Army surrendered. Right there, the textiles were stolen, and the mill was set on fire. At this point, the British raiders went right down Fulling Mill Road to Newtown. They went to the Bird in Hand, where the tailors were hard at work. A sentry saw them coming and fired a warning shot. The guards took up their positions around the building, but they were overrun. I mean, there were 70 armed British soldiers coming at them. In this skirmish, 5 Continental soldiers were killed, 4 were gravely wounded, and captured were the major, 8 other officers, 24 privates, the tailors, and enough fabrics to make 500 uniforms. When those British troops and their captives headed back to Philly, they would have passed right by the farm. But they weren't the only ones. Continental soldiers were also in the neighborhood at a various time. There is a diary by a Continental soldier who talks about crossing the Chamonix Creek at Cuckoldstown. Remember, that was the name of Bridgetown at the time. And he says that they camped on the high ground, and the next day they marched into Four Lanes End, and from there they went to Bristol and over to Burlington. I'm not sure the highlands he described, whether it was to the right or to the left, was it the farm or over toward the tunnels? But in any event, I'm sure that the owners of the farm would have been aware of these Continental soldiers passing through their area. Other things that were going on at the time, Jenks purchased the Preston Mill, and in 1780, Edward Hicks was born. As I said, that was at the coffee house. And in 1782, the population in Middletown, and I thought this was interesting, 698 whites, 423 blacks, and 124 dwellings. Here's a little fun fact, and this was, again, when I get diving into these rabbit holes and trying to find out what's going on with these people, what their lives were like, and how they might have been connected. This was amazing. We know that Edward Hicks' mother died when he was just a toddler, and he was left in the care of David and Elizabeth Twining. He did a painting later of their farm. Well, what I found out is that David Twining is actually the nephew of Godfrey Kirk. So I just thought that was a little fun fact, tying him to the house as well. Okay, so Daniel Martin lived there for 42 years on that farm, and then he sold it to James Linton. All right, James Linton was an original flipper. He didn't stay there very long. He was a birthright Quaker from Wrightstown, married to Anne Crosdale, but I do believe that this was just an investment property for him because he lived there. He only owned it for a year. The next owner was Ezekiel Everett. He was of English descent. He came to Bucks County from Hunterdon County. He was a miller. He lived on the farm for 7 years. He purchased a lot of lots inside Langhorne Borough, and so he added to the acreage of the property. Okay, this is a picture of the Langhorne Academy, Bellevue Academy, that used to be in Langhorne Borough. His children went there, and his children ended up marrying people known as Tomlinson, Longshore, Vandergrift, a lot of familiar names in the area. One went on to be head of Orphans Court. In 1805, Four Lanes End is renamed and it now becomes Attleboro. This was when a post office was established. Okay, and again, it makes it fun when you're looking through these things because the names of towns keep changing. All right, he lived there for 7 years, Ezekiel Everett. He moved on. He sold the property to Robert Beatty. And as his deed describes, he sold the house together with all of the house, the barn, the stable, the outhouses, and all of the improvements for $6,000. So you get the sense that this was becoming a much more active farm, a more developed farm, and that continued with the Beatty family. They made the first significant change to the house. If you remember, the top of the house was low on the one side. It was only like a 3/4 roof. They're the ones who took it all the way across and evened it out. Certainly, it would have been broken through at this time, and they lived in the entire house. They made lots of improvements. They lived on this property for 49 years, which made them the longest owner to date at that point. They built the barn that you can still see the remnants of. Okay, and I know when I was a kid, you could still see the barn itself, although over time now it has fallen in. But the walls are still there. That was their contribution. Okay, when Robert Beatty died, his wife, Rachel, and her son, 2 sons, inherited the property, which was called a plantation. They also had property in Dolington. He also left $500 to each of his 4 daughters, but his son John received no inheritance because, quote, he received a considerable education at his father's expense. So he got his part through that. Rachel remained on the property after her husband died. She lived there with her son and his wife until her death, and at that point they switched it over to the other brother. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, at this point, after 49 years, the property had to be sold because Samuel Beatty had died. He had debts, and it was sold by the Orphans Court to provide education for his children. The property, which was 78 acres, it remained that size, was deeded to Samuel Comfort. At this point, Samuel Comfort is the owner of the mill across the street, the old Preston Mill. And so now he gains this property. His son is running that, and he sells it then to Jesse, his son, to live there. They were very well off. The Comforts were a very interesting family. They had properties in Middletown and Newtown. They were the subject of all kinds of newspaper articles about their properties, about their social activities, their travel. They went on a European tour on a steamship. They visited the Paris Exposition. They had relatives who visited them from New York who were involved in gold mining out in West. And one of their relatives held a diplomatic position in Bombay. So all of a sudden, instead of these people being very small town and provincial, this family was very, very involved and very worldly. Jesse added a lot of land to the property itself. He acquired other lands around, and then he ended up selling some of his land holdings for the construction of the tunnels where the railroad passed over. But you can see here at age 45, with 3 children, he had his property valued at $40,000 and personal property at $30,000. In 1860, that would have been a lot of money. Okay, that brings us up to the Civil War. And of course, you know the Quaker dilemma, which I don't really have to go into much. The Quakers were opposed to slavery, but they were also opposed to war. The women of Attleboro formed the Ladies' Aid, and there's a newspaper article that describes how they met every Wednesday over the drugstore, and they sewed garments and had fundraisers for the war effort. Okay, after 6 years, Jesse Comfort sold the property to Henry Parry. Okay, and at this point, you'll notice that the property has shrunk. Okay, so the house then went from prior to that had been with 78 acres. Now it's down to 32. Because as I said, Jesse Comfort was a miller and he did retain the areas that surrounded the mills. So that continued to be his job. But Henry Parry bought the property, and he was a very respected man in the community. He was born in Philadelphia. He moved to Middletown when he was 15, and he finished his education at the Pennington Seminary. He purchased the farm in '65, and he worked on it successfully until he began a new career where he was selling coal, lumber, and fertilizer down around Business Route 1 and the Langhorne train station. He was a visionary. He knew that the train line was coming in from Philadelphia to Trenton, and he recognized how important that would be as far as transportation and as far as moving merchandise. So he acquired a lot and he started selling those products that way. He also knew that the trolley line was coming up from Bristol, and it crossed right there and went on up to Langhorne, and further it ended up going all the way up toward Durham. So it's interesting to me when I think about how Four Lanes and Langhorne developed really around those two crossing roads, the 4 lanes coming together. Then just further down the hill, you now have these this new form of transportation crossing again, okay, down right by the Langhorne train station. Henry was a birthright Quaker. He was very involved in the community. He was a stockholder in the Langhorne Improvement Company, which promoted development in the area. And he was really looked upon with a lot of admiration and trust. He was the chief burgess of the borough for 2 years, and he served 2 terms on borough council. He was the director of the newly created National Bank in Newtown, and he was also president of People's National Bank in Langhorne for 7 years. The growth of the businesses in this area and the growth of the neighborhood really depended on the banks, and Henry had a lot to do with that. This plaque that you see here, this down in the corner, let me see if I can get to it, right here, presented by HCP, 1899. You can see that at Middletown Friends meeting, that's on the sidewalk, a plaque that he gave. So very interesting. He started out as a farmer, and then he became involved in selling these other products. And I do have to laugh because I found newspaper articles and advertisements with his name on it. And he and his group, the Langhorne Improvement Agency, were really touting how wonderful it is to live in the country and all the advantages of living up here in this small town, and really trying to entice a lot of development. And right now we have a different feeling about that. Like, okay, maybe the town is big enough and we have to be really careful about how we're selling it. But at that point, that was very, very important. And again, the transportation had a lot to do with that effect. And because the train line came through, they needed a train station, and the train station had to have a name. The boroughs around there were competing for the name because this is actually closer to Pendle, which at that point was known as Eden. And after some wrangling back and forth, it was finally decided it will be called Langhorne. So that's how the name came to be. Okay, and at that point, Henry Parry was doing very well. He moved down into Langhorne Manor, and he sold the 32 acres and the home after 13 years to William Gillingham. The thing that I was very intrigued about Gillingham is that he was a businessman, he was a postmaster, he was a leader in politics, served on the borough committee. So as you'll see, these people were very, very involved in town. They were very involved in business. And he was known as one of the best known men in the borough, a man who has many friends and no enemies. But he died young, and his funeral was private. It says, quote, owing to the fact that his house had been under quarantine for scarlet fever, as all 5 of his children had had it in the winter. And he died right after. It does not say in his death certificate that he died of scarlet fever, but you have to wonder. And just having been through the pandemic that we were through ourselves, I found this very interesting, that they were affected by this at that time. He is buried in Middletown Friends Cemetery. This article here talks about what we now call the Langhorne Hotel. At that time was called, I don't know how you say it, Buckets Hotel. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that name. But interesting story, the owner of the hotel was arrested for murder, for manslaughter, because there was an unruly guest who didn't want to leave the bar when the bar was closed. He was thrown out, and early the next morning was found dead on the sidewalk with his head cracked open. William Gillingham stood up for him. He posted bail for him. He spoke for him at the trial, and he was in fact acquitted of that. But we don't often think about barroom drama in Langhorne, but there was. Okay, after 5 years, he sold the property to Frank Osmond. And you can see at this point that life is really starting to change. Frank Osmond was, again, a very active man. He was a birthright Quaker. He was active in Middletown Friends meeting. He served as the treasurer. He served on grand juries. He was middle of Langhorne Council, and he was also a trustee of the fire company. But I was most interested in his wife, Louisa. For one thing, Louisa's name appears on the deed, which I thought was just great because you didn't see that before. And Louisa was very involved in the Langhorne cirrhosis. This was a women's club that the women gathered weekly or monthly. They had these elaborate meetings, and the meetings were so interesting. I wish I had known her, and I wish I had been a part of these meetings because they're just intriguing. They met monthly to engage in readings of poetry, and they had all these topics that they would discuss. They would assign topics, and people would come back and report on it. Remember, there were no internet. There was no internet at this time, so I don't know how they did it. But the topics that they discussed, a couple of them were the Negro as a slave, Whittier as an abolitionist, the Paris exhibition, papers on George Sand and Balzac, talking about is newspaper reading still profitable? I thought that was a funny one. And they also talked about suffrage. They had meetings about the suffrage and women's title to citizenship. Louisa Osmond was a very clear thinker. She did a delightful travel talk that was so good that it made the Bristol newspaper. And she commented that if there was no object, no interest, no imagination in our travels, we might as well stay home. But we must go with our minds open and be receptive to learn and observe, and not be filled with our idea that our ideas and methods are correct simply because they are our own. We must be broad enough to look at life from the standpoint of those that we are with. So clearly, she was an independent thinker, very worldly in her outlook, and I believe that was certainly due to her Quaker upbringing. But when I compare her to the man who had 4 wives who all died after having multiple kids, just thinking about how time has passed, how life has changed, this is a very, very different experience for her. And it was a life I would have enjoyed. Like I said, I wish I had known her. The more I read, the more I liked about her. As I said, mass transportation was coming to this area. The first train line was completed. The first electric trolley was operated by William Parry, the son of Henry. And that brings of Langhorne Hill. Langhorne, the trolley line ran from Langhorne to Newtown. But at this point, the Pennsylvania Railroad had built the tunnels, had the railroad going over, and they refused to allow the trolley tracks to run under the tunnels. So you have to picture this. You get on a trolley in Newtown, and you get to the end of the tunnel. You get off the trolley. You walk through the mud, through the ice, through the dirt, through the snow, whatever it is, under the tunnel, and then you get on another trolley that's waiting there, and that one takes you into Langhorne. I mean, that is just as absurd as you can imagine, but that's how it was. Well, the people finally had enough of this. This is ridiculous. So the people from the trolley company got together. They got all the materials they needed to complete the tracks, and they hid them in the woods. This is a true story. I am not making this up. They come the weekend, they rush out, and they complete the track. They build it so that it goes from one end to the other, seamless. Monday morning comes, the people from the Pennsylvania Railroad find out about it. The administration was furious, and they sent 100 railroad workers to destroy that section of track. Of course, the people in Langhorne were having none of it. The people on the trolley line were having none of it. And so a battle ensued. And apparently, from the articles I read, the air was blue. People were so upset. The fire company came. They brought their pumper, tanker, whatever it's called, and they came and they started shooting water from the hoses at the railroad workers who were busy trying to dismantle the trolley tracks. And those people, because they had axes, chopped up all the fire hoses. I mean, it just went on and on. Finally, they were overwhelmed. The trolley people were outnumbered, and the railroad people did dismantle the track. It went to court. A judge upheld for the railroad company. There was appeal that was made, and it was ready to go to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Right before that happened, somebody noticed that while the one tunnel was nice and wide, that other tunnel, that lower one in the picture, was actually impinging on the right-of-way for the road. It was built too small. And when that fact was brought up to the railroad company, they knew that they would either have to give in or destroy their tunnel and rebuild it. And so they finally gave in. But isn't that just remarkable? And this trolley then became a major form of transportation for work, for pleasure. People would go on picnics on the trolley, and they would have passed right past the farm. Okay, we're up to 1909 when Frank Osmond sells to David Harry. He didn't keep it very long, and we really don't know anything about him except that his wife was Mary. That's all I can tell you. But he sold the property to Reverend Henry Jackson. And this is where some serious questions came into my mind. Reverend Henry Jackson was educated at Lafayette College, Princeton University, and Princeton Theological Seminary. He organized the Swarthmore Presbyterian Church, and then he became the pastor of the Christian Union Congregational Church in Upper Montclair, New Jersey. After he retired from the ministry, he moved to New York City, where he was the president of the Social Engineering Institute, and he became a special agent for community organization for the Federal Bureau of Education in Washington. This is a really interesting man. He has done a tremendous amount, and this is just a sample of the books that he published in his lifetime. How in the world did he get to Langhorne? You know, this kept me up at night, I can tell you, trying to figure out how in the world this happened. I was just flummoxed. I could not figure out how that was. I found newspaper articles that said that he used his Langhorne home as his summer home. So he really didn't live there. There were a couple of newspaper articles saying that his son Robert was recovering from yellow fever there. But again, he didn't live on the farm. So how did he get there? Why did he buy it? I just couldn't figure that out until I started looking at his wife. His wife's name was Viola. Her last name was Lawhead. And I found that Guy Lawhead lived on the farm. This was her brother. Guy Lawhead was an interesting character on his own. He was from West Virginia. He apparently, from what I could find, kind of kicked around, wasn't sure what to do, was living here, living there, working on a farm in Bensalem. It seemed to me that he needed some help. And all I can picture is that Viola said to her husband, hey, buy a farm for this guy and help him out. And so I'm thinking that's what happened, because Henry never did live there, but Guy did. And Guy's name, talk about confusion, the spelling keeps changing everywhere you look, but it's him. He named it Core Valley Farm. And this is the first time that property had a name, Core Valley Farm. And very interesting article here. It's a little hard to read, but it's bragging about this giant egg that his Wyandotte hen laid. And this egg was so big, the circumference and measurements are all there, that it was on display in Langhorne at the drugstore in the window. And they say that it was bigger than the egg that it's exhibited in Newtown, which just cracked me up that there would be that kind of a kind of a rivalry, who had the biggest egg, but there you go. He also raised Berkshire pigs, and I found the record, believe it or not, of his pig, and this pig's name, not this particular one, but one that looks just like it, had the provocative name of Climax the Fourth. I have no idea where that came from either, but these are all the kinds of records you can find. You can find pig registries. Who knew? He lived there for a few years. He met and married the cashier at the local store. They moved to Washington or National Avenue in Langhorne, and he started an auto repair business. And he also joined with Thompson. And if you're familiar with Business Route 1, Thompson Motor Service is still there. And there is a picture of him out in front. That's the first time I could find a photograph of one of the farm residents. Okay, so they deeded the property. Henry deeded the property then to Cheshire and Grace Boone. Once the brother-in-law was settled, had his own home, was married, on to a new career, he sold the property to Cheshire and Grace Boone. And that became another question. How in the world did they get connected? Cheshire Boone was a birthright Quaker from Indiana. He was the son of an academic from Michigan State Normal School, which is now Eastern Michigan University. He became a teacher of the manual arts in the Montclair, New Jersey public school system. And then he went to, furthered his degrees, and he was then part of the Montclair State University. He attended and he presented at national educational and arts conferences all over the US and Europe. I found dozens and dozens of articles talking about Cheshire Boone appearing here, Cheshire Boone appearing there, all over. So this was a big deal. This man was a big deal. He coordinated the writing of a popular 11-volume series of books based on the Montessori method called The Library of Work and Play. And I was very, very fortunate to be able to actually buy his book. So I have his the piece that he wrote. He was a member of the Salmagundi Club. That's a society dedicated to the fine arts. So very, very interesting man. But what I found is that he knew Reverend Jackson through their love of the arts. And they were both in Montclair, New Jersey. So they had established a friendship through this common interest. I imagine they must have invited Cheshire and Grace down to the farm. And when they sold it, Cheshire and Grace bought it. Okay, now there is a picture of Grace Boone. And what a wonderful woman she is. I wish I had known her as well. Grace Boone was from Michigan. She went to Michigan Normal School where she met her husband. and she became a professor's wife while she was there. She had a tremendous thirst for knowledge in every facet of human endeavor, and she had a particular interest in the theater. Grace Boone would go out in the morning and slop the hogs and milk the cows and work in the fields. And then in the afternoon, evening, she would get all dressed to the nines and she would go to every single opening on Broadway. She had an incredible collection of the playbills from all of the plays. She was friends with the mother of John Updike, and I have letters that she wrote in her own hand criticizing John Updike's new books because they just have too much sex in them. But she was just an amazing person. She immediately joined the Cirrhosis, just as Louisa Osmond had. And actually, Reverend Jackson was a speaker there. So he's the one who introduced her to that group. She became very involved in the Society of Langhorne and also of Newtown. And the picture you see there on the right where she's all dressed up, that is at a wedding for Nam Watkins at Middletown Friends meeting. What's important about the Boones is they were the last owners of the property, and they did make some significant changes. The area that I have there in yellow, they added on to the side of the property and wrapped around the back. And this was a 2-story addition that included a sunroom. And right there, they did add these doors. Remember, this would have been a solid wall at one time, but they joined the building and opened it up. That's what it looked like in the back when they lived there. When they left, Mr. Boone died in the 30s. She continued on until the 60s. Okay, there it is in 1969 when she would have left. And from there, she moved into a house on State Street in Newtown. And there we go. This is what it looked like in 1988 after the county took it over. The county took it over because they were building the dam for Core Creek. They were also building dams on other areas, Peace Valley Park and Churchville Nature Center, that area, as part of a flood control. And there was speculation early on that this house would be destroyed because the dam would have been in the way. But they did decide to save the house and move the dam further down the creek. And aren't we glad that they did? Okay, this is what the house looks like right now. You can see that the county, as I said, they removed the stucco, they changed some of these porches. They added this porch, wasn't here. They changed this one. They added siding. They did put on a new roof. But this kind of work was done about 30 years ago, and then it stopped. So there's a lot more to be done. That's what the back of the house looked like with the sunroom addition on it. That's what it looks like right now. This is another outbuilding on the property. This is known as the carriage house. And at one point when Mrs. Boone had the farm and she had many cows and was selling milk, it was from right here. This would have been like a store window where people would have come. This part was used as an apartment for the caretakers. Okay, this shows you that Mr. Boone was pretty amazing. As I said, he wrote for journals, for the American Federation of the Arts. He was an officer in that. He was involved in social events. Here's a picture of his passport that he needed when he was traveling to do presentations over in England. A very, very interesting man. He went from this teaching career to all of a sudden being a dealer in American art for the Macbeth Gallery. This is more about Mrs. Boone. Here's the registration of their pigs. She had one called Duchess and another called, what was it, Black Diamond, I think. And they called the farm Bimini Farm. We all call it Boone Farm. We've called it Boone Farm forever. But in fact, the day they moved in, they changed the name to Bimini Farm. And you can see that right here on their stationery. You can see that right here on this milk bottle. And this became the next big all-consuming mystery to me. Why in the world did they call it Bimini Farm? Knowing what I did about the Boones and what they were interested in and how worldly they were and how involved they were in the arts, I investigated songs, I investigated theater, I looked at poetry and prose. I couldn't find anything that would show me that Bimini was big at that time, except that Bimini was actually the mythological place of the Fountain of Youth. And I did find a thesis that Mrs. Boone wrote when she was in college, all about the importance of teaching mythology. She made the case that what kids were learning today was drivel, and they needed to learn the classic myths from the Greeks and the Romans. It was a very scholarly article, so you know that was important to her. And all I could think is that this was a complete change in their life. He had been a teacher, now he's selling art. She had been a professor's wife, now she puts on the census that she is a farmer. A complete change in life. And I only can imagine that this Core Creek that runs right past their front porch must have represented the Fountain of Youth to them, a major change in their life. If anybody can prove me wrong, please tell me, because I really, really want to know. But I have sounded out that theory with a few other people who said, go with it. You know, well, we may never know, but it's based on their life experience and the changes that they made in life and their interests, it just seems to make sense. So I'm sticking with it. Okay, after 53 years, Grace Boone lived on that farm more than 30 years by herself because her husband had passed. She did sell to the Neshaminy Water Resources Authority, and they held that property for 54 years. Okay, this is what it will look like. We are so excited that this property will become the African American Museum of Bucks County. Not only have we documented that there were 2 slaves on this property, but Linda Sally, who was the president of the African American Museum, had encountered many years ago women from Bristol who talked about coming up to the Boone Farm and working. These women were had moved here to Bristol through the Great Migration. So there again is one more tie to the African American experience related to this home. This property will have classroom space, exhibit space. It will have an elevator in the back that is a clear glass elevator. It will so allow people access to both floors. I believe the upper top, the attic space will be used as office space, as well as that carriage house that I showed you. There will be picnic groves and gardens and walkways. It's just going to be a magical place for people to come. The creek runs right past the right side of the building as you're looking at it. Okay, this is what it looks like now. I got to go in October after living in this building for 18 months, doing the research, living there in my head, imagining these people, imagining what the building looked like, how their lives would have been impacted by the building and how they might have impacted the building themselves. It was an unbelievable thrill for me to be able to go inside. Now there's no electricity, very uneven floors. I mean, it's truly primitive, but the feeling that I got was just amazing. In this picture, you can see the little entrance to the oven. You see those benches are gone, okay? And everything is now exposed. This is the opposite side. If I just turned around, that would be the front door. This is how we got from one level to the other. Remember the steps that the Boones put in right here? They're gone. This is an entrance to a basement, and we had to climb up this way, up the chair. It was a little precarious, no electricity, so we're all using our torches and our flashlights and our phones to be able to see. But just the same, it was a thrill. Here you can see the hand-hewn boards that would have been the studs for this building. a fireplace. There's a fireplace upstairs and downstairs in that second section. The curved stairs and the little closet. There's the attic. This is the part that was added in the 1800s to even out the building. And there's an example, information about the museum. The groundbreaking occurred in November. And we're just so excited that this is finally going to happen. This has been a dream of the African American community in our area. This particular museum has existed since 2014, but it's only been a mobile museum. So they go into schools, they go into nursing homes, they go into libraries. They put exhibits up at places like the Bucks County Visitor Center, Pearl Buck, other locations, but they don't have a permanent home, and that's what this will be. So we are so excited about it, but the cost is daunting. The budget, the estimate came in about $2 million more than they expected over the course of the pandemic. They're desperately looking to raise funds and exploring all different avenues for that. Their website is there, and you can give donations right on that, on the website. The book that I wrote is a gift to the African American Museum. I don't make anything off it at all. Every penny goes right to their building fund. So I did give you a lot of information, but there's still more to learn. And I hope that you will check out the book and know that your purchase price then goes to a very good cause. The book is available at the Middletown Township building, and it's also available at the Commonplace Reader bookstore in Yardley. Both of those places have agreed to sell it without taking any money for themselves. That, again, the whole $20 goes right to the building fund. So you can get them there. And then I do have, I will bring copies to Middletown Friends meeting for quarterly on Sunday. Okay, I dedicate this book to my parents. My parents were a young couple. They met at Bell Telephone on Bellevue Avenue in Langhorne. They fell in love. They needed a place to live, and Mrs. Boone needed a caretaker. So she rented my parents that little white building as their first home, their honeymoon cottage. My grandmother painted it, wallpapered it. My mother made that their happy little place. And Mrs. Boone gave my dad $10 a month off the rent if my dad would milk her pet cow every day. At this point, she was in her 80s. She still had one cow that she loved. The cow's name was Valentine. And as a struggling young couple, they were more than happy to milk that cow to get the money off the rent. So my mother remembers going into the kitchen and Mrs. Boone baking bread in the oven. I never lived there. My parents moved out right before I was born, but I have to say that the Boone Farm was always a part of our family lore. There was never a time that we drove up 413 for any reason. If we went past the Boone Farm, we heard Boone Farm stories. And so it really just became a very close connection. It was just part of our family. Even though I had never set foot on the property, we just felt that we knew it so well, and it meant so much to them. When my parents retired, they moved out to Lancaster, but every time they would come home to see me, and I live right around the corner from the farm, every time they'd come home, they would loop past the farm and then come home and bemoan, how bad it looked, how sad it was. And my dad never lived to hear the good news, but right before my mom went into hospice, we got the word that the county commissioners were in fact giving this property to the African American Museum. My mother knew that my husband and I had been members of the museum, had supported them for a number of years. And she was just thrilled to know that this property would be saved and that the property would be put to good use. So it wasn't until after my mom died that I really started looking into this. And I don't know why, I just felt driven to learn more about it. And after 18 months, it became a book. I never went into it with that intention, but that was the result. So anyway, some of the resources that I used, as I said, Catherine Auerbach was generous to let me use the application for the National Registry. All of the Quaker records on ancestry were wonderful to read. Newspaper archives, various books. I went to all the historic associations locally and talked to a lot of people to see what I could find. And thank you for sticking with me. That's 300 years of history, very compressed, but I hope you enjoyed it.